All right. Hi, I'm David Feldman, and this is the mop-up for March 30th, 2023. Donald Trump, after becoming the first president ever to be impeached twice, now becomes the first president in American history to be criminally indicted. All I can say is it's about time. It's about time Trump was indicted, and it's about time we here in America started indicting our presidents. The indictment is said to have caught Trump by surprise in what seemed like a feint and then a misdirection. It was announced just yesterday that the Manhattan grand jury, looking into Donald Trump's hush payment scheme to silence porn star Stormy Daniels, was taking a month off. Nobody was expecting an indictment today. Trump even announced earlier this week that no charges were going to be filed from the Manhattan DA. Adding to the shock of tonight's indictment was Alvin Bragg. He's the Manhattan DA. Adding to the shock of all this was that Alvin Bragg announced earlier this morning that he was expanding the scope of his investigation to look into Trump's attempts to silence another woman that Trump reportedly had sex with. The implication behind all of this was more work had to be done before an indictment was handed down. But surprise, surprise, prosecutors filed the indictment at around 5 p.m. Eastern on Thursday evening, roughly 3 hours after the grand jury began meeting again. We thought they were on a vacation for a month. The Manhattan DA is reportedly negotiating right now with the Secret Service on the logistics of bringing Donald Trump into a New York State courthouse where Trump will be fingerprinted. And of course, a mugshot will be taken. Let me just say that again. Donald Trump will be fingerprinted and a mugshot will be taken. At this point, the indictment is sealed, so we have no idea what the former president has been charged with. But we are almost certain it will revolve around falsifying business records to hide fixer Michael Cohen's payment of roughly $130,000 back in 2016, weeks before the presidential election, roughly $130,000 to buy the silence of porn star Stormy Daniels. Falsifying business records is said to be a charge that can stick. The Manhattan DA has won countless convictions on that one in the past year. Some say that if Bragg, however, tries to tie Trump to a campaign finance violation, where the hush money is seen as an illegal campaign contribution, well, then Bragg could be attempting to prosecute Trump on charges that could be thrown out of court by a judge more sympathetic to Donald Trump. With several criminal indictments now pending in Fulton County, Georgia, perhaps, and Washington, D.C., Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg has become the first prosecutor to come forward with an actual indictment of Donald Trump or any president in American history. Now, according to the New York Times, Trump could only be barred from running for office had he been convicted in one of his 2 impeachment trials, and he was not convicted. He has declared his candidacy. He's running for president in 2024. The Times also says that Texas Governor Rick Perry ran for president in 2016, having been indicted for abuse of power down in Texas. And in 1920, as most of my listeners already know, socialist Eugene Debs, serving time for violating the Espionage Act, ran for president from jail. It is our Justice Department's official policy not to offer up a criminal indictment of a sitting president. The Supreme Court ruled in the Bill Clinton-Paula Jones trial, however, that a sitting president can be tried in a civil court. Donald Trump is not a sitting president, so he is open for a criminal indictment as well as several civil lawsuits that are now pending. For more on this, we are joined by the Reverend Barry W. Lynn, whose new book, Paid to Piss People Off, will be released on April Fool's Day. The Reverend Barry W. Lynn is a lawyer, a member of the Supreme Court Bar, as well as an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. For nearly a quarter of a century, the Reverend Barry W. Lynn ran Americans United for separation of church and state. He joins us today from Massachusetts. Hello, Reverend.
Hello, nice to be back with you.
Were you surprised that Trump was indicted today?
I really was not surprised by it, although there was certainly the evidence that you presented of Bragg making an announcement that he might be considering a second woman who may have been given hush money, and presumably that's the Playboy playmate who has said that she too had sex with Donald Trump. But it's not surprising because you want to get this information out. You want it to be a surprise because you don't want people waiting around for a day or 2 days planning what they're going to do to respond to it. And I think it's more to make this difficult to organize around than anything else, that they were kind of playing footsie about this until it actually happened.
Right. So there are two, we don't really know what he's been indicted for, correct?
That's correct. And he will appear. I'd be very surprised if his lawyers, who are, better lawyers, arguably, than the ones he's had in the past, would not have already worked out exactly what will happen Tuesday or Wednesday of next week when he shows up in New York and is, as you noted, fingerprinted, a mugshot taken, and presumably bail set.
Right. Now we're getting reports, I don't know if you heard, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, where Donald Trump makes his home over at Mar-a-Lago, we're getting reports that if Trump doesn't volunteer to surrender, Ron DeSantis says he will not cooperate with an extradition request. And that would be in direct violation of the Constitution. Isn't he obligated? Ron DeSantis is I think he's a Harvard Law School graduate.
Yeah, so, he is.
Well, so then he probably doesn't know about Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution.
No, that whole thing about, and I don't think he really, it's hard for me, and I think for many people to believe that Ron DeSantis, went anywhere beyond maybe middle school. But the truth is he knows enough, he should know enough, and he certainly cannot be serious that he would not.
Well, we're just getting word that Ron DeSantis has just banned the U.S. Constitution in Florida. That's the latest book to be banned. What happens if the governor of Florida, hypothetically, refuses to cooperate with the Manhattan DA? Then New York goes down to Florida and grabs him. But
yes.
Is that how it works?
That is what would happen in this unlikely scenario. I don't think that's going to happen because I think Donald Trump, above all other interests now, is how can I use this with that 30% of Republicans who want me in power again? Because in the event that he doesn't end up being indicted or he doesn't show up on his own volition, he loses the ability to say, I've always been telling the truth. Stormy Daniels, I never even heard of her. And he loses all that if he fights a truly no-win proposition of simply saying, I refuse to leave Mar-a-Lago, come in, with the weapons like this is Waco.
Or Scarface.
He can't do that. Or Scarface,
yeah.
Which I haven't seen for many, many years. I should watch it again.
I'm hoping it's more of a Scarface situation. A man can pray, right,
Reverend?
See it.
Yes, you can absolutely do that.
What kind? Go ahead.
No, I mean, ever since this indictment came down and started to hit the wire services around 5 o'clock Eastern, everybody that talks about it, whether they're on CNN or the Fox News channel, they always talk about how this is unprecedented. That means absolutely nothing in a court of law. Even if it was uniquely unprecedented, it would still have no meaning. It's historical. That's all it is. It has no implications at all in the treatment or the likely journey of this indictment.
So, what can the Republicans actually do to protect Donald Trump? First of all, do you think they really want to protect him? Do you think Ron DeSantis is Ron DeSantis happy that Trump has been indicted?
No, I don't think so. He shouldn't be, because, in fact, no Republican who has an interest in running during the Republican primary has an interest in preserving this character, Donald Trump, because if he has 30% of the votes in primaries, and we know that his supporters are, shall we say, more fully supportive than the supporters of most other candidates, he will do so well in so many Republican primaries that there's shots of a DeSantis, of a Pompeo, of Chris Christie, declines precipitously. The best thing for them is for Donald Trump somehow to end up going away. If he is emboldened, and the supporters are emboldened by what happens in this, when this grand jury venture eventually gets started. By the way, it doesn't start the next day. It could be months and months before any legal proceedings occur. Donald Trump's lawyers will spend a lot of time with all kinds of motions. They will move for summary judgment, which means that we'll file some papers, and then the judge will look at the papers and say, well, you don't really have a case.
So in summary judgment would be ruling in favor of Trump, saying, for example, the indictment over the payment to Stormy Daniels being a contribution in kind. It's not an illegal campaign contribution. I'm throwing this charge out. That would be, a judge would do that in a summary judgment.
Not necessarily, but certainly a judge would have the power to do that. But this idea that is terribly difficult prosecution to make, I am not sure that, I'm quite sure I don't agree with that, because we have to remember what this is. In New York, there is no state law that says you can't pay some money to anyone to not tell someone else about anything, not even a crime. But if you indict for the misdemeanor of falsifying business records, which, as you pointed out, the district attorney is really good at that, it is, generally speaking, only a misdemeanor, only a misdemeanor. In order to make it a felony for this filing false records, you have to link it to something else. So you have to prove to the jury, or first to the judge and then to the jury, that the payment of $130,000 should be viewed as an improper donation to Trump's presidential campaign. And this is where a lot of commentators say, well, that's going to be very difficult to prove. I don't think so, because I think if you have evidence from people, not just Michael Cohen, who is a somewhat flawed witness, but I can get to that in a minute. But if there's evidence that Donald Trump knew how damaging this would be, not just for his relationship with Melania, because there's a lot of reports that she already knew about this, but what about for his supporters? I think most of us remember when the famous Access Hollywood tape came out, and Trump is there talking about grabbing women by the peas, and
watch it there, Reverend.
That would true. Yeah, well, that's why I didn't want to get too graphic. Okay. But no, so
hang on for one second.
So that's
whenever I have the Reverend on.
It's very difficult to shock me. Right. But here's what's going to happen. That he could get away with, because as many religious right leaders said at the time, Donald Trump, he's not running to be the pastor of our church. This may have been a failing, but it was a long time ago. This is much more difficult to explain away by any corruption of Christian theology. And I think Trump knew that. And Trump thought, if this all comes out a matter of weeks before the election, this, my good Christian supporters, will not accept. And it could cost me the election. If they can demonstrate that that's a fear that he had, then this paying of the hush money has a major impact on election laws. And these, remember, are not federal election laws. These are state election laws. And I think that a jury in New York would be much more likely to successfully convict if they can find evidence that he knew that disclosure of the Stormy Daniels situation would crater his candidacy in the last few weeks.
Interesting thing about jurisdiction that I found confusing. It is a federal election. He's running for president, and yet campaign contributions to a presidential campaign can fall under the jurisdiction of the Manhattan DA because the crime took place in Manhattan.
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, we thought that was the case during the famous Al Gore, George Bush conflagration. Everybody that thought they had read the Constitution thought the state law in Florida was what should ultimately govern. But if at the last minute, when it gets to the Supreme Court, all of a sudden they have federalized what should have been a state law matter. And now the question is, what if any effect would this have on the Trump situation? But I think Bragg as a DA has a complete authority to treat this, and it should be treated as a state offense, looking at the elements that you have to prove for a conviction in the state of New York.
Okay, I don't mean to belabor this, but in my estimation, not knowing anything, he broke a federal law, a federal campaign finance law that Merrick Garland decided not to prosecute Trump for. I'm surprised that a Manhattan DA can prosecute a president using a federal law. Can you?
No, well, no. My understanding that the most likely thing is that there is this law, a state law in the state of New York. Most states don't have them, that reflects upon the way in which contributions can be made in any campaign that's occurring in the state of New York.
I see. So, by the way, we don't know yet. I don't think I'm looking at the proverbial wire. We don't know what the charges are. I'd like to think, since I'm rooting for Alvin Bragg, Manhattan DA, that he's going to surprise us. That he certainly surprised me today. I didn't think an indictment would be coming down for at least another month. Is this perhaps part of a larger case that the Attorney General, Letitia James, is prosecuting statewide? Falsifying business records getting him under oath on falsifying business records could assist the Attorney General in her civil lawsuit against Trump, the way he inflated what he was worth when he was looking for a loan and then deflated what he was worth when he was paying his taxes.
Right. Yeah, it's possible, but in that civil case you're talking about, I don't believe he's a defendant in any of the counts in that case. The corporations are, but I don't think Donald Trump personally has been charged with any civil or criminal violation by Letitia James.
Right.
I don't think so. I don't know. So, yeah, I think the bigger question is whether there's been any kind of collaboration between the Justice Department, the Georgia judiciary, and Merrick Garland over the evidence in this case. the Justice Department says unequivocally, we did not do that. We have never shared evidence nor received evidence from the district attorney in Manhattan. And I kind of believe that to be the case. I don't think there's been this collusion at all. And I think it just means whatever Mr. Bragg has on Donald Trump is probably all he's going to get. He is not going to be able to take some kind of evidence from another proceeding and piggyback it on what's going on in the next few months or years.
Right.
In this. Yeah.
It's my understanding that this was a special grand jury. This investigation has been going on for 5 years. I think there are 23 people sitting on that jury. I don't know if they've been sitting. I don't know how long they've been sitting there. What is the protocol? Does the Manhattan DA, is he allowed to ignore a grand jury's indictment? Does he go before the grand jury and ask for the indictment? Does he ask for the vote? How does that work? I know you're a member of the Supreme Court bar and you're an attorney. This may be a little too deep into Manhattan's legal system.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know, but I can do what most people do on CNN. It's speculate.
Right.
You're right. It's a 23-member grand jury. And unlike many states, the only thing you need in order to indict in New York is to have 12 members of that 23-member grand jury. And in fact, you have to have only 16 of the 23 people physically present to hear evidence. In other words, that becomes the quorum for the continuation of work by the grand jury. In other states, you've got to get near unanimity, but in New York, it's 12 out of 23.
Right. What powers do the Republicans in Washington, D.C. have to disrupt this case? I know that the execrable, I don't know if I pronounced execrable properly, but Jim Jordan, who is chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, he has threatened to drag Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg before his committee. Has that ever happened before? And
I don't think it's ever happened. And Jim Jordan, who I testified before many, many times when he was not the chairman, when Jerry Nadler was the chairman, and he was a doofus. I mean, the guy really didn't understand anything. It almost makes you believe that he maybe didn't know that his wrestlers were being sexually abused by a doctor while he was the coach of the wrestling team. I mean, maybe he's kind of dead that he didn't even notice that. But seriously, he ran a committee hearing today in which he had two witnesses favorable to the position that he was holding on an issue I've already forgotten. The Democrats, he then dismissed them. Democrats objected and said, wait a minute, we get a chance to also ask questions of these witnesses. And Jordan basically said, no, you don't. And then they yelled at each other for a while, and then he just gavelled the committee hearing to an end.
Right.
He will do anything. Will he try this? Of course he will. Is he going to be successful? Almost every time Jim Jordan, since the Republicans took over the Congress or the House, almost every time he's gone on Fox and they ask him, what are you going to do tomorrow? And he said, it's going to be powerful testimony.
Right.
It's never powerful testimony,
right.
But he's going to continue to do it because Jim Jordan represents a district in Ohio that literally, I mean, there must be Democrats who live there, but not very many. I mean, he is one of the safest Republican seats in Congress.
Right. Last question, and then I want to bring up your book and the special office hours book club event that we're doing Friday night. So, as I said at the top of this segment, Governor Ron DeSantis has said he will not cooperate with the Manhattan DA. So, what happens if Donald Trump resists arrest? What is the role that the Secret Service plays in all this. We're in uncharted territory. There's never been a president before who's been indicted criminally, and the Secret Service is supposed to protect his body, but are they constitutionally bound to protect him from being arrested by?
No.
Do they cooperate with the Manhattan DA? What is their obligation?
I would think that their obligation is in fact to cooperate with whatever law enforcement authorities are sent by the DA in Manhattan down to Florida if it comes to that. I personally do not think it will come to that because, as I mentioned earlier, I think Donald Trump wants his followers to see his mugshot, see him walk in, perhaps saying a few words about the witch hunt again. He thinks that it will raise him vast amounts of money, and I don't think he's wrong. I think the best thing for fundraising, leave Florida, walk in, make a comment before you get into the courtroom and afterwards, and just hope those 30% of people that supported you yesterday will still support you on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week when all this happens.
The Reverend Barry W. Lynn, you, for nearly a quarter of a century, ran Americans United for Separation of Church and State. You have been battling the evangelicals in this country since you graduated from law school. So
that's true.
If Donald Trump had called you in 2016 and said, Reverend, you know the evangelicals, you know Graham and Falwell and all the other sons of God. I've got this porn star who I had sex with. I can't lose my evangelical base. Am I going to lose them? Should I pay her the $130? I hope I'm getting the number right, but should I pay her $130,000? Or do you think the evangelicals will forgive me? Because they would. I mean, looking back, they would have forgiven him, right?
Yeah. No, I'm not so sure of that. I think there's a distinction between forgiving him for making his comments about women's genitals, but I don't think that would translate into them forgiving him for his conduct with Stormy Daniels.
But looking back, but Reverend, not to, I don't mean to be rude, but he has not lost the evangelical base. Has maybe a little. I mean, no matter what he does, they seem to stick with him.
I think, though, there is, first of all, as a Protestant, if he wanted to be forgiven, what he should do and should have done, if he thought this was going to lose votes, which he didn't, would be to publicly do what Jimmy Swaggart, the evangelist, caught with a hooker in a Louisiana hotel room. He would have done what that evangelical pastor did the first time he was caught. Cry, plead for forgiveness. What Jimmy Swaggart did not do the second time, he shut up. He said, I'm not doing any press conferences. I'm not crying again. And that's when Swaggart started to lose real support. This is not the kind of, the woman wrote an entire book about this. If you're a Catholic, a Roman Catholic in this country, and you fall short of what you should be doing, it's okay to go to the local priest or the bishop of your jurisdiction and say you're sorry to him. That's all that Catholics expect. But for Protestants, they expect you to go down, grovel, plead, weep before they'll forgive you. But then they often do. And I think this, whatever the conduct was with the people at that Billy Bush was talking about on that tape, with the Access Hollywood tape, whatever it was, I think there were so many people who also claimed to be Christian legislators who said things like grabbing someone, that's not an assault. In other words, they would redefine it. And a lot of these not so good Christian evangelicals will buy that. They will listen to that and they will say, son of a gun, because they wouldn't say it louder than that or with another word.
Right.
I guess he's okay. He's being supported by all these people I like so much who are in the halls of Congress.
Well, you've been very generous with your time. I want to talk about the special event we're doing tomorrow night. We've been talking with the Reverend Barry W. Lynn. Besides being an attorney and a member of the Supreme Court Bar, he is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and has dedicated most of his career and life running Americans United for separation of church and state, taking on members of his own religious community and members of my religious community to tell them to butt out, stay out of this. We don't, this is not what our founding fathers wanted. You have worked diligently. I can't think of anybody who has worked harder to keep religion out of the public square. The Reverend Barry W. Lynn has written a book. It comes out April Fool's Day. It's entitled Paid to Piss People Off. And it's a trilogy of 3 books. And Friday night at 8 p.m., from 8 till 9, we're going to do a book launch of the book Porn, which is book 2 of your trilogy. Is that correct?
That is correct. I will mention to people tomorrow where that title came from. I was originally actually going to call it The Fellowship of the Rings, but then some character wrote a book with that name before I got to use it. So I had to change it. And luckily, a high school student helped me out.
Yeah, but you have fought for the rights of Wiccans and witches and porn stars.
Yes, I have. And I don't want to give too much away, but I will remind particularly people who remember that my spouse, Joanne, Dr. Lynn, I used to get calls from women in the adult industry occasionally at home, and they had all kinds of issues, often not even related to their profession. And I would talk to them. And Joanne said to me one day after a phone call, she said, Barry, if you weren't defending their rights, they wouldn't give you the time of day. So more stories tomorrow.
That sounds, I love the idea of you're married to a doctor, but you're the one who wants to go out and do house calls.
I never did that.
Yeah.
But you should ask me tomorrow if there was ever a time when I got curious enough not to do anything, but to go to some event where who knows what activity would be occurring. If you remember, ask me that question.
I will.
And I was talking to a reporter the other day about a comment, which, I'll talk about tomorrow. And she said, do you watch the news anymore? And if so, what do you think of it? And when you hear a discussion of the separation in church and state, do you think I could do a lot better than that?
Right.
And the latter is not true, but the former is I am obsessed with news. I care about it. I just wish we had more of it.
Right.
That is to say, good news.
Well, today we had some good news. Today's good news. Yeah. Let me plug tomorrow.
It's good news. Go ahead.
Let me plug to our listeners right now. Go to the description of this episode. If you're listening to this or watching this, in the description is a Zoom link to office hours Friday night at 8 p.m. We will start at 8 p.m. And all you need is, you don't even need Zoom. There's a link. You click on that link. It's free. You can, if you don't have Zoom, you'll be provided phone numbers. You can listen in via phone. And we will talk to the Reverend Barry W. Lynn about not just pornography and his work taking on the Meese Commission and protecting the rights of pornographers. We will talk about the true meaning of the First Amendment, because a lot of us forget that the First Amendment is just not about freedom of speech. The First Amendment is freedom from religion, the Establishment Clause. And Americans need to get this drummed into their tiny little brains that the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause specifically says, take your religion in Washington. When you walk into the Capitol, take your religious ideas and put them where the sun don't shine. And I'm not talking about Seattle. That is the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Nobody cares what your religion is. Shut up about it when you're in the temple of democracy. And we're going to talk about the First Amendment, and I'll keep trying to talk about pornography if you'll indulge me in your work. So go to the description of this episode. The link is there. It's free. We're going to talk about the Reverend's new book. It comes out April Fool's Day, Paid to Piss People Off. What a great title for a book. And if you can't see the link, go to my website, hit office hours. The link will take you there. Or if you subscribe to my newsletter, it will have the link in there. Get to meet and see and talk to the Reverend, and maybe he'll do. You don't do faith healing, right?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. Can you fake it?
Yeah, but anything else?
You can't
anything
fake
else? I don't. Yeah, I don't exorcise demons.
None
either,
of that stuff. Oh, okay.
But I did meet. I've met several times the woman who was the stunt double for the woman who played Reagan in the original Exorcist. She's a very short woman.
Linda Blair.
They wanted to hire her. Well, they wanted to hire her to be Linda Blair's stunt double because Linda Blair was a bit too young to engage in certain activities, one in particular involving a crucifix.
Yes.
And that's all we're going to say.
Okay.
But she's a delightful woman that was a stunt double.
Did you ever think
Linda Blair?
Did you ever think you would live long enough when Linda Blair would not be the most satanic person? That Tony Blair would be the real Satan? Tony Blair is Satan. But
yeah, I'll be looking into that. Yeah, I'll be looking into that. I must attend another Zoom on another matter.
Goodbye.
But I will.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. That's the Reverend Barry W. Lynn, a gift to the universe. I cannot stress this enough. Come join us Friday night, March 31st at 8 p.m. Eastern for office hours. The Reverend Barry W. Lynn will be discussing porn. I think that's book 2 in his trilogy, Paid to Piss People Off. And then we will have my old friend, comedian John Ross, will stop by and we'll record an episode of my podcast. So if you'd like to watch us record the podcast, you'll stick around after the Reverend Barry W. Lynn leaves, and it's all free. It's all on Zoom, and you can dial in and watch and listen and join the conversation. Get to meet the Reverend Barry W. Lynn. We'll take your questions. So please do that. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. The only reason you're listening to me right now or watching this is because a friend of yours copied and then pasted the link of an episode of mine and shared it on social media or through email. So if you enjoyed this, please share it. That's the best way to help me. Please like this. It helps a lot. If you like this, hit the like button and leave comments. I don't answer all the comments. I read every comment. Longtime listeners know that I read every comment because the comments bleed into the show. You can tell that the topics we discuss are informed by the comments. Please subscribe to this. It helps if you subscribe. I think that covers everything. Go to my website, davidfeldmanshow.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. It comes out every Friday night. The link for office hours is either in the description to this episode, or you can find it in my newsletter or over at my website. I'm David Feldman, reminding you to stay strong and protect the weak. Rotten hell, Donald Trump and your entire family of malingerers. It's time for the Professors and Marianne. Professor Marianne Cummings is a particle physicist as well as a brilliant artist. Seriously, a brilliant artist. She is also Parks Commissioner, Aurora, Illinois, and Professor Ann Lee is a brilliant writer. You can read her over at the Daily Kos every day. She writes under the handle Annie Lee, and every night at midnight since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, she does an update on the war. And I always like to, when she's here, like to get an update on the war in Ukraine. I was reading somewhere, I don't know where it was. Oh, I think it was in Foreign Affairs last night, how every war we're promised is going to be over in a matter of days. And that even the war in Iraq that we like to think the first one was over in a matter of days lasted. They just voted today to get rid of the war authorization, but kicking and screaming, we're still at war officially with Iraq. What is happening with the war in Ukraine that was supposed to be over in days?
Well, it's always about promising. It's still about money. Well, there's so much to talk about, but tomorrow is going to be. Today was day 400 in the war of the invasion. It's been 400 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, and where the Russians are is at a point where they don't seem to be in good shape. The regular Russian army and some of their internal fighting has been meant to sort of marginalize Prigozhin and the Wagner people, who are being, of course, sent into battle kind of like cannon fodder. But they've reached the point where Wagner troops have done the ones who were recruited from prison have reached the end of their 6 months contract, and some are actually being released into regular Russian society, which will be really problematic considering that, the guy who killed 50 people, I think got killed in an air attack, but I'm sure there's some other folks like that who.
Well, I was reading like the cemeteries, that a lot of people are upset that these people are being buried in cemeteries alongside World War II heroes.
Yeah, Wagner has their own cemeteries, fortunately, but it's true that some people are being repatriated to non-Wagner cemeteries. But Wagner, as I recall, has its own set of cemeteries. The problem, of course, is counting who really died and who is just sort of missing. There's an argument about that as well. There's going to be a Ukrainian counteroffensive somewhere around April or May, which means that it could really actually happen anytime. Mm-hmm. But they're waiting for weather. It's going to be about whether the ground is solid enough to have a major tank offensive, which I think is what's going to happen. I think this counteroffensive, hopefully, or whatever your position is, it's probably better for the war to end it quicker than let it go on, because at some moment, all of the different stressors are going to be exercised, whether it's resources or military goods of all kinds, whether it's airplanes or ammunition. It's going to be much worse if it goes on longer. So there's a kind of a front loading of various things. The French may give Mirage fighters, the Challenger British tanks have arrived, and the Ukrainians have been well trained on them. And I think that's going to be an interesting offensive if it's going to be built around certain types of British and German main battle tanks. So it'll actually be very interesting for those people who like following kind of mechanical stuff.
Right.
Also, the air resources have sort of freed up all of the discussion for about 6 months over whether Slovakia and Poland were going to transfer MiG-29s to the Ukrainians because that's their standard air. They don't require extra training for it, and they've been modified so that they have radiation armament. This is the HARMS rockets that will take out Russian radars. So I know this is in the weeds from a detail point of view, but really this counteroffensive, it may be the last major military struggle of the entire conflict, because the Russians will probably not be able to mount another offensive. And the Ukrainians are kind of at their limit in terms of what they can provide in terms of personnel. So that's kind of where the war is. There's no discussion of negotiations, because I think it's still about war, and the rest is disinformation. A lot of they're a subcontractor for the Russians, and they're on that did cyber attacks was just leaked to the West, to the Germans, and so that's kind of interesting to see what their cyber attack stuff looks like, and it includes material that goes back for a couple of years and their attacks on various other countries. So that's today. That was very interesting in terms of security leak and how the Germans are sort of looking at it. So that's the kind of the current state of that. There have been a few sort of resistance actions in Russia where factories are sort of catching on fire, which is sort of interesting and doesn't get talked about a lot. There's very little in the way of street opposition in Russia. They put a 10% surtax on any foreign company that now leaves Russia, because there has been a significant capital flight, which sort of accentuates the sanction situation. And that whole business of sanctions is made more complicated by, on the one hand, the so-called West, or the EU, is sort of doing without the kind of gas and oil that the Russians were getting most of their revenue from, which they still are actually. But the Chinese have sort of picked up the slack and are getting natural gas and oil at a discount, which the Russians, I mean, there's a cap that's been put in at about $60 a barrel, but it currently is the case that the Indians and the Russian and the Chinese are picking up the kind of the slack on some fossil fuels coming from Russia. But there have been a new sanction regime, and so that's kind of, there's going to be a lot of pressure. By the end of the year, it's going to be difficult for the Russians, especially if they have to go through another winter. Things will be much more desperate.
Well, how does it end? Does it end like World War II or World War I? I have to think it ends like World War I.
Well, it looks more like World War I relative to the standoff in the East and the South. But if I were going to put, my hope is that, because I sort of fall on the side of the Ukrainians, is that their counteroffensive succeeds and drives the Russians to the table. And so that someone can step in, like the UN, and put in a ceasefire and a demilitarized zone and all those kinds of things, because at some moment, it's still about money. It's still about, BlackRock and a bunch of other folks. It's about the post-war economy, ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
It's still that problem. They can't keep doing it this way, partially because there's a major, I've been listening to a fellow who does a podcast called Inside Russia, and he's talked a lot about the brain drain, about the million people who, from the professional managerial class, who have fled to the West from Russia, which is going to affect their industrial capacity for at least the next 5 to 10 years. There's going to be a lot of problems.
Now, is America, during World War II, we were the beneficiary of Hitler's brain drain. When you say that we can get 1 million members of the professional managerial class, God, I look at Professor Marianne Cummings salivating over the thought of 1 million more members of the professional managerial class.
Yeah, well, I don't know who those guys are, and I kind of wonder about those numbers too. Russia pumps out more STEM graduates every year than we do. And I can tell you from direct experience, the Russian education in science and math is excellent.
Why is that?
They put money into it. They don't make people go into debt to get a science degree. And by the way, one of my best students told me flat out that she couldn't stay in physics. She says, I can't, wonder from every other year whether I'm going to have a job. I've got student loans to pay off. She went with her boyfriend and works for Chevron.
Nice.
And I can't blame them.
Right.
It's like nobody in the world, not just Russia, but nobody in the world, no one in the world battles their highly educated people with this level of debt. And so you're not, you're going to take on this debt. You're sure as hell not going to get a PhD in physics, unless it's to work for the oil companies, in which case you could go in with a BS degree and start working for the oil company, and they'll pay your, higher education and make a ton of money,
Right.
So.
Is there anything else on Ukraine you have to report?
No, I could go on forever, unfortunately, but we're still just before one major battle. That's essentially what's going to come up in X number of weeks. We're going to have one big offensive, and we'll see what happens after that.
And by then, the Patriot missiles will be installed, and they've been trained here in the States to work those.
Well, there's been Patriot training in Oklahoma, I think, and this is all from public knowledge. Now, I think that there's actually been a lot more training and stuff going on sub rosa. So there will be Patriot missiles. They will be defending Kyiv. Essentially, the Patriot missiles are there to protect Kyiv. And there's a whole ton of other stuff. When you look at the details, the Ukrainians are not in that good a shape. They're about 60% of the different types of missiles that the Russians have are not being stopped by anyone. The Ukrainians like to crank out a lot of disinformation about how many drones they shoot down. But the fact of the matter is they're only attending to 20 or 30% of the Russian ordnance that's coming in at them. So it's going to be down to some really basic warfare soon, aside from all the usual stories.
Right.
Professor N, do you see this escalating to overt NATO, actual regular NATO troops in Ukraine? I know that there's a lot of specialists, and I know there's American troops there. Whoever they are, maybe they're Blackwater, who knows?
I think you're correct in assuming that there may be some, not unlike the Vietnam War or the Korean War, where there were Russian pilots were involved in the Air Force. They've already softened the ground in interviews with Ukrainian members of the Ukrainian Air Force who have sort of talked about foreign pilots being used. So I think there is this, if there's going to be a major offensive and they need to dominate the airspace, I think you're going to see at least NATO pilots somewhere involved in there, not being announced, but that it's going to happen, I think, in order to generate air superiority, because the Ukrainian Air Force was initially so small relative to the Russian one.
And what does that mean if we have NATO soldiers?
Well, they're going to have to prove, just like the problem with Korea, you didn't, I don't think they've ever admitted that there were Russian pilots, right?
I see.
And how many decades went on until they admitted that there were, Russian pilots here and there and everywhere in various conflicts. So,
and does it work this way where Americans knew that there were Russian pilots and they accepted it and they didn't want to escalate and turn it into something bigger?
That was a story that came out from Vietnam, because they knew that, you could just tell from the quality of the pilots that they had to change tactics. In other words, more standoff and less dogfighting and all that sort of jazz. I think that will happen in the case of Ukraine. You'll see more standoff weapons, and hopefully, NATO pilots won't get captured. That will be the deal. If nobody gets captured, then who knows? So it's still a major disinformation campaign, and that's kind of how this war is going to wind up, with a lot of weird stories.
Don't get captured. Professor Marianne?
Well, I think I'm going back to what Professor Ann said a little while ago. I mean, there are a lot of people making money off of this war. When we were 10 years into our invasion of Afghanistan, Julian Assange just basically summarized it. He says, this isn't a war. This is a money laundering operation.
Right.
This is just sending a bunch of tax dollars from several countries into the coffers of, politicians, munitions manufacturers, Wall Street hedge funds who are funding these things. And, so.
Do you think these people are pure evil, the war profiteers? They just say money for death? Or do they say, what, war is a constant in nature, better it's here in Ukraine than at home? How do they justify?
Well, I'm sure all of the above. I mean, in a very... I've been watching a whole bunch of BBC dramatizations, actually quite good at low budget, of the former English kings and the politics that they had to deal with. And my God, they're all sociopaths at one point. You just sort of have to be, I remember 20 years ago getting into a little fisticuffs with some people because the question was, was Richard III a good king or a bad king?
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, I think one of the best decisions he made was to kill those kids. Look,
just as a policy in general.
Basically,
you had him in the tower. What else do you do with him?
You can't have a weak government when your enemies were, and people back then. I mean, when you got overthrown, you got killed. Your head was on a spike, or you were hanging, off of the walls of the city. So, people were ruthless. And in wars, now the king doesn't go out and fight. You never see the people you kill. The wars the planning is conducted in staterooms and high-end hotels
right.
and conference rooms, and, with people who themselves probably never was in a cockpit of a fighter plane or ever anywhere near a war zone
right.
now, unfortunately. And they just look at it like a chessboard going, hey, well, this is great because, sooner or later you have to test your stuff. Russia was testing a lot of its stuff in Syria over the last 10 years. So they got an idea about what they have.
Right.
Last time we had a real tank war was over 30 years ago in Iraq. We don't really know what in other words, we don't know what we have. So it's just this.
When you say a tank war, the war between Iraq and Iran.
No, the war between us and Iraq in 1991.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That guy, he's on Fox News. He seems to actually know something about war. I don't like his politics. Doug McGregor. He actually got famous for leading a battalion of tanks and taking out basically, a whole huge section of Iraq's tank tank battalions. And anyway, he kind of disobeyed orders, but I guess the field marshal kind of gave him the go-ahead. But at least he knows what he's talking about. But that's it. That was like 1991. That was over 30 years ago. In other words, there's no one in the United States military directly that has had the experience of actually being in combat and everything that entails. Like you have to be able to tow tanks away. You have to be able to fix tanks. You have to get supplies. You have to maneuver in windstorms, in mud, in adverse conditions. You have to coordinate with your air defense. In other words, no one has had the direct experience. So it's one thing to have a fancy schmancy tank. It's another thing to be able to have experience in the operational arena that, is going on right now. And yeah, I mean, maybe, you're going to have holodecks like on the Starship Enterprise in the near future. That will be so realistic that you don't actually have to kill people to have the visceral experience of, fighting. But anyway, okay, so they're they're going, hey, we get it for free. I mean, I've heard these words. We're getting this for free. We're letting the Ukrainians do the dying for us. And I'm sure there's special forces there and everything else, but
Professor Lee, I'll give you the last word on Ukraine, and then we'll.
It's yes, thank you. It's a throughput problem. Essentially, for example, Poland and Ukraine are going to have very serious, huge armies at the end of whatever this war is going to be. And the simple example could be that old Soviet MiG-29 fighters are being transferred from former Soviet bloc countries to Ukraine to fill out the ones that they've lost. And as a matter of throughput, that means that America will be making more F-35s and F-18s to sell to Poland and Ukraine and Finland. And it's just throughput. They're just going to make more money. It's just that's kind of what's going on right now. And in terms of obsolescence, all of the Abrams tanks that are going to go to this theater are not and I know this is minutia, but the M1A2 is the top of the line U.S. tank, but there are a ton of M1A1 tanks which don't have a lot of fancy electronics, and those are probably the ones that are going to go to Ukraine. They're not as good on the one hand, whatever not as good is, but they're still going to, there's going to be a lot of bloodshed anyway.
Okay. Well, the big story, obviously, is in our courtrooms. Gwyneth Paltrow won her trial. What do you think?
Did
she won? Yeah, she's not at fault in the ski crash trial, and took place back in 2016.
Her lawyers wore the guy down, right? Because he's older, he's more infirm now, and it didn't look very high. He just couldn't afford the legal defense, I think.
And so, congratulations.
Although I did like that 3D simulation where you see, Gwyneth Paltrow falling on top of the guy. That was kind of cool.
Thank you, Industrial Light and Magic. There's something else happened today in the court. Oh, yes. Donald Trump was indicted. We have we have to talk about it briefly. Professor Marianne Cummings.
Well, I guess season 9 of the Trump story is kicking off in really interesting style. I mean, all right, what do I think of this? I think this is a lot of noise. I'm not sure it's going to hurt Trump in the long run. I mean, he's already been...
Might help him.
Might actually help him. And, the only thing that we have kind of as a precedent was the prosecution of John Edwards on basically the same felony. These are felonies because these are campaign finance frauds.
Right.
And that's exactly what that that's exactly what they tried John Edwards on, because John Edwards, or at least an aide to John Edwards, got an old family friend, the Bunny Mellon, I guess of the Carnegie Mellon, the Mellon of the Carnegie Mellon fame. She's like 100 years old, and she and another wealthy donor, I think, combined almost a grand total of $1 million in hush monies to keep his mistress, who was pregnant with his child at the time of the 2008 campaign. What a bastard. What a dog. Mm-hmm. But, whilst his wife is dying of incurable cancer.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, there's no question what he was just a terrible human being about that. But, the decision to go ahead with this indictment was kind of, at the time, it turned a few heads. Like, okay, the guy first of all, we all know what happened, and he lost. And we all know what happened because it was the National Enquirer broke that story, and they get those things right, and they got it right. I mean, down to the detail. I mean, so it wasn't, I guess the case in terms of what happened was at that point wasn't in dispute. It was like, does the hush money paid for by a couple of wealthy benefactors to the Edwards campaign constitute a violation of campaign finance laws, which at that time said individuals could give no more than $2,300 apiece. And if you ruled this hush money as a campaign expenditure, because, it was good for his campaign to keep this all under wraps, then I guess you could make a case. But the bottom line was, the jury basically didn't buy any of this. Many of them were kind of, later said something like, he's a bad guy, but this is not a good use of the limited resources of the judicial system. Because by that time he was defeated, he had no career, people knew the story, going through with this was just kind of a waste of public resources. And on the other hand, Edwards is a smart lawyer, so right. He assembled a good legal team. So the precedence is that. And so I don't know, what they think they're going to do. I know that's already highly political. In the Edwards case, it was considered political because the court that it was actually that tried him was North Carolina, and the prosecutors and the judge were Republicans who the Republican Party did not like John Edwards. So, there was just kind of a whiff all through of this being a highly political case. And he basically got off on all charges. That was right. The bottom line of that. So,
Professor Lee?
That could happen in the case of Trump, yeah. But I think it got a little more complicated recently because I think I don't know who they were hearing in terms of getting David Pecker back in there, but because he was not only a rebuttal witness, but I think that they've resurrected, I think, the Karen McDougal affair that Trump had, which ran over 10 months, which is a lot more, I think, complicated than the Stormy Daniels matter. And I think perhaps because Pecker was offered some sort of immunity deal, that they were able to get a little bit more details about what Pecker had in his safe and all that catch and kill stuff. So I don't know, maybe that's been the effect. There was some blather about that particular thing. It's still about timing. I mean, I think it's good to get this kind of front end kind of noise out of the way. I agree with Marianne about the noise issue here, because once the Georgia stuff comes through, I think that's going to be a lot clearer what obstruction of justice looks like. Mm-hmm. Whereas this one is, it had problems. That's why it sort of failed. Bragg didn't move forward with it a year ago. So I think this particular case won't be that revelatory. And, he's going to raise money off of the mugshots. The mugshots are going to, you're just going to see it in the fundraising. And he's going to play his sort of bad boy thing. But I don't know. It's so bizarre now. I mean, that he showed his January 6th. He was proud of the insurrection at his rally in Waco.
Right.
And I mean, just the fact that it was in Waco was just amazing in and of itself.
On the anniversary.
Yeah. And it has lots of other nuance that I don't want to yet read into it because I don't have, facts to back me up. But it is interesting to me that the one subgroup that broke off from the Unification Church has a compound only 40 miles from Waco. So there's a whole nother thing going on there as well in terms of right-wing activity. So, but regardless of that, and we'll see more as whether we get to a political campaign, it's just all noisiness. Are this, as David, as you mentioned, what is the Secret Service going to do in terms of protecting Trump when he's, incarcerated, at whatever moment he gets incarcerated, if at all.
Right.
And that's one problem. So, as I say, I think when it gets to Georgia, I think things are going to be a lot clearer and more problematic for Trump.
What do you think the reaction is going to be from his minions?
Oh, there could be violence.
Because minions don't already know about Stormy Daniels.
Well, I'm talking about, the bikers.
There's just death threats galore. Some idiot decided they would send white powder to Alvin Bragg.
Right.
That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, this is just, simple vandalism at one level, but at another level, they're idiots. Well, one guy already. Remember the guy who stormed the FBI office in Kansas or something and got killed? Because this is all, there's just crazy people out there. So who knows?
If Trump goes away, does this problem go away? The problem of fascism and the anti-democratic, owning the libs, the hell with the rule of law. Does it go away with Trump or does it persist?
I think it persists when you see that Idaho now has a new category of something. What is it? Abortion trafficking. They have a new legal category they're trying out. This is just, it's getting uglier.
It's getting uglier, but there isn't a Reagan-esque, Trump-esque, George W. Bush-esque charismatic leader who can carry them over the finish line. Do you need somebody like Trump to keep this burning? And is DeSantis that person? I don't think DeSantis is. If you take out Trump, you're not going to eliminate racism and the far-right conservatism, but are they less of a threat, Professor Marianne?
I don't see how they're less of a threat in that now the Democratic Party proper has completely taken over the neocons, the neolibs, the national security state. Dems are cheering the CIA and the FBI. They're okay with expanded surveillance and all. It's just like they keep pushing the political center of, at least in the federal level, further and further to the right. So the only space the Republicans have left are these, real, fringe characters. Meanwhile, the rest of the country as a whole seems to be moving to the left in terms of what they want and what they think is fine. And, it's this kind of like prevailing winds at ground level versus up in the stratosphere or something. It's
right.
Just
there's a famous story about the Georgetown set having dinner when Bill and Hillary took over the White House. Sally Quinn and Ben Brett.
Sally Quinn. Yeah, that's right. Oh, we don't know those people. They do now.
and George Will. And they were saying, look what they've done to our Washington, D.C.
Oh.
Do you remember that story?
Oh, I absolutely remember that story. To me, that explained everything.
I'm sorry?
That explained everything. I mean, I could never understand, even when I got on Forbes on Fox, and there was like, hey, that crazy guy who was the editor of Investors Business Daily. We were talking about the collapse at the time, but I sort of said, hey, William O'Neill, like, what the hell was your problem with Bill Clinton anyway? I mean, he was like totally Republican. He was absolutely on board with all of what you want to a degree we know now that we didn't know back in, at least people who identified as liberals did not appreciate back in the 90s. But they just said, he said, and actually it wasn't too far from what Hillary once said about that. It was a cultural thing. The Clintons were just represented that generation, the long-haired hippie draft dodgers, pot smokers, and it just galled. And they came out of that, Hillary, of course, wasn't. If you called Hillary a hippie, you didn't know what hippies were. But, Bill definitely, hung around the hippie crowd, I'm sure. And they both adopted at least some nominally very liberal positions. And so I think it was just a visceral cultural reaction to the Clintons that had nothing to do with their actual policies, which were, even at the time, pretty right-wing, it turned out. So,
well, you could say that it was the pragmatics of the situation, the kind of Dick Morris sort of business that I think Bill took on,
What a can-do guy that was. He pumped up old Bill after his 1994 loss. Right. Oh, good Lord.
I kind of have that Sally Quinn, Ben Bradley, George Will reaction when I look at Donald Trump. It's like, it's how grotesque he is. Look what he's doing to my Washington, D.C. But is he as big a threat is he the existential threat to our country that we...
Considering that the Democratic leadership gave him almost everything he wanted substantially, including expanded surveillance powers and more powers and everything else, the only thing they didn't vote for because wasn't needed was the tax cuts. I mean, existential threat.
Right.
No, I think he was a bit of a loose cannon, but believe me, the Democratic Party would have vastly preferred, the leadership would have vastly preferred a second term of Trump than a President Bernard Sanders.
Well,
that is for sure.
Let's talk about a more important story, Donziger and Chevron, and give us a bit of a backstory here, because it's a little, it's not being covered for obvious reasons.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. The oil company Texaco,
now owned by Chevron,
taken over by Chevron. But, from 1964 to 2000, basically dumped, some enormous amount, 14 trillion barrels of oil into indigenous lands that are sacred to these tribes in Ecuador. And he took them to court and won. And he became their lawyer. And I think it was in 2011, an Ecuadorian court entered something like $18 or $19 billion judgment against, I think by then it was Chevron, that was reduced to $9.5 billion for contamination resulting from that oil production. And then Chevron sued Donziger and others in New York, arguing that he and his associate had somehow secured this judgment by fraud. And they, at their own expense, and paid this guy upwards of $2 million, got a judge in Ecuador to testify in this court, which wasn't a court. And this is where I don't understand, and I would like to get a lawyer like Reverend Barry Lynn to explain this to me, how this prosecution was handled. the federal prosecutors refused to prosecute this case. And it was so the judge appointed private prosecutors from the law firm that represented Chevron in several other cases. I don't know how that was possible. And I guess they sentenced him to like about a year under house arrest, except that they kept postponing the judgment and kept him under house arrest for the entirety of the trial. So he was effectively under house arrest for 3 years. And nobody, had been held that long on civil charges. And so Donziger basically appealed wanted to clear his entire conviction because this was an obvious miscarriage of justice. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court refused, like yesterday, they basically turned it down. They said they refused to even hear it. But there was a couple of, it was like a 6-3 decision, but there were a couple of prominent dissenting voices. Alito, I think, Gorsuch was one of the dissenting voices. I think Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were the dissenting voices, and they dissented basically on legal grounds like, this is blatant conflict of interest, and this is not, proper legal order. Now, it might be, as a friend of mine had pointed out, many people, the courts are now handling cases that way. I mean, many people who are innocent, especially if they're poor, have been kind of coerced into pleading guilty because they just can't afford to be in jail. And if they go through with a trial, they may, first of all, they can't make bail, so they have to stay in jail until the trial happens. And then they could be found guilty with an even bigger sentence. So the courts have been outsourcing judgment to private lawyers for quite a while. And I think maybe Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were just kind of unaware of this, but nonetheless, it's appalling. It's appalling, and I don't know where the is here, but this is. But when you have a government, when you have the politics captured by corporations, then it just seeps all into every level of your judicial system, every level of your regulatory systems, every level of your financial institutions. We're in bad shape.
Yeah. Wouldn't you say that his case got more complicated because of not unlike Assange, the changing government in Ecuador, that kind of made it more complicated?
I think the fact that so that was the judgment, but I think the Donziger's case, Chevron sued Donziger in New York federal court. I mean, so that part of the case, of course, the Ecuadorians, of course, have not seen a penny of their settlement. So that might be the case, that is complicated. Probably never see any of that money, no doubt, unless there's a radical change in our government. But right. This was specifically the case against Donziger himself, on charges of fraud. And, I think they were accusing him of ghostwriting a key environmental report and bribing the presiding judge, which they brought up, and the guy was clearly lying. But, that's what was just so wild about this case. Ugh.
Yeah, very disappointing.
It's frustrating. And I applaud, but you know what? He's getting a lot of airplay now. He's getting a lot of attention. He's now a free man. But, I think he's been disbarred, though, because of his conviction.
Yeah.
Before you go, Professor Lee, what are you reading for pleasure?
I read what I'm currently reading is for some stuff I'm doing online. George Lukash's History and Class Consciousness, and I'm sort of backstopping an online kind of seminar that David Harvey is running on Karl Marx's Grundrisse. So that's kind of what I read. I don't have any pleasurable reading.
Okay.
Oh no, then you should read Professor Mike Steinell's book. That is actually on my list. That is a
I'm
great read.
I'm quite intrigued by the fact that music is
Right.
available with the text itself.
Right. And of course, paid to piss people off.
Indeed.
Which we'll be doing at office hours Friday night. Thank you, Professor Marianne. Follow Professor Marianne on Twitter at Razor Girl. Thank you, Professor Ann Lee. Read her every day over at the Daily Kos at Annie Lee. Thank you both.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.